It was supposed to be a historic moment. For months, Europe had been preparing the world for it. Headlines promised justice. Politicians spoke with moral certainty. Experts called it inevitable. Russia would pay. The plan sounded simple, almost elegant. Take the profits from frozen Russian state assets and turn them into weapons, aid, and survival for Ukraine. No new taxes. No new debt. Just accountability. The aggressor funds the defense. A perfect story, morally clean, politically popular, financially painless. Or so it seemed. Then came December. Behind closed doors in Brussels, something went wrong. After hours of negotiations, after days of leaks and weeks of expectations, the announcement finally arrived, and it stunned everyone. The seizure was off. The reparations loan was dead. The money would not be taken from Russia after all. Instead, Europe chose a far less heroic option. It would borrow the money itself. Tens of billions added to public debt. A bill quietly passed to taxpayers. The frozen Russian assets? Still frozen. Untouched. Locked away. The official explanation was dull. Legal complexity. Technical constraints. Maintaining unity. But that wasn't the real reason. What actually happened inside that room was not a bureaucratic disagreement. It was fear. Fear of something far bigger than politics. Fear of a chain reaction that could have shaken Europe's financial system to its core. Because once you strip away the speeches and slogans, one uncomfortable truth emerged. Confiscating those assets wasn't free money. It was a loaded weapon pointed inward. Europe looked over the edge and blinked. Tonight we're going to unpack why. Not the surface-level story you saw in the headlines, but the deeper one, where law, finance, and power collide. A story about lawsuits measured in trillions. About a little-known financial institution that quietly holds Europe together. About a central bank warning so severe it stopped an entire geopolitical strategy in its tracks. This is not a story about generosity. It's not a story about unity. It's a story about limits. And once you understand those limits, you'll understand why in the modern world finance doesn't follow politics. Politics follows finance. Let's begin with the illusion that made this plan seem possible in the first place. At first glance, the idea looked flawless. Since 2022, hundreds of billions of dollars belonging to Russia's central bank had been frozen by the G7. Not seized. Not spent. Just sitting there, silent, immobilized, seemingly useless. To politicians in Brussels, it looked like an untapped reservoir. They weren't talking about taking the principal. Not yet. That would sound too radical. Too aggressive. Instead, they focused on something far more convenient. The interest. Because frozen assets don't just sit there. They earn money. As bonds matured and cash accumulated, those funds began generating billions in interest. Money Russia couldn't touch but Europe could see. And that's when the narrative shifted. This wasn't confiscation, they argued. This was a windfall. An extraordinary gain produced by extraordinary circumstances. In their telling, this money was no longer truly Russia's. It was excess. It was passive. It was morally available. And above all, it was politically perfect. No need to explain new borrowing to voters. No painful debates about budgets or deficits. No direct cost to European citizens. Ukraine would be funded. Russia would pay. Europe would look decisive. It felt like financial alchemy, turning frozen numbers on a balance sheet into real-world power without consequences. But here's the problem with alchemy: it ignores physics. In global finance, nothing exists in isolation. Every asset sits inside a legal framework. Every transaction rests on trust. And every shortcut eventually reveals the risk it was hiding. Because those Russian assets were not locked in a vault under an EU flag. They were embedded deep inside the plumbing of the global financial system. And the deeper you go into that plumbing, the less room there is for political theater. The architects of the plan assumed one critical thing: that Europe controlled the money simply because it was frozen on European soil. That assumption was wrong. Those funds weren't held by governments. They weren't stored by treasuries. They were sitting inside a single, highly concentrated financial artery, one that Europe itself depends on to function every single day. Touch that artery the wrong way and the damage wouldn't stop at Russia. It would spread inward. Quietly at first. Then all at once. And while Brussels was busy drafting legislation and rehearsing moral arguments, Moscow was reading the fine print. Because Russia understood something Europe had chosen to ignore. You don't fight financial wars with slogans, you fight them with leverage. And Russia still had it. In the next part, we're going to talk about the weakest point in Europe's entire strategy. A company most people have never heard of, but one that holds the European financial system together. This is where the illusion of free money begins to collapse. Every system has a pressure point. In Europe's plan, that pressure point wasn't a politician, a treaty, or even a central bank. It was a company most Europeans had never heard of, and almost no one had voted for. Euroclear. If global finance were a body, Euroclear would be its circulatory system. Invisible. Taken for granted. Absolutely essential. This is where ownership changes hands. Where bonds settle. Where trillions in assets quietly move every day without headlines or speeches. Pension funds, banks, governments, they all rely on it. Not ideologically. Structurally. And that's where the Russian money was sitting. Not metaphorically. Literally. Roughly 2/3 of all frozen Russian central bank assets were concentrated there, inside Euroclear's accounts. Not in Washington. Not in London. In Belgium. In one legal jurisdiction. In one balance sheet. That concentration was never supposed to matter, until someone tried to touch the money. Here's what Brussels underestimated. Euroclear doesn't just hold Russian assets. It also holds Western assets that exist outside the West, including inside Russia. For years, European banks, funds, and institutions had capital trapped there, stuck by sanctions, unable to leave but still legally owned. Moscow knew exactly where that capital was. And more importantly, it knew how to reach it. So while Europe was arguing about morality, Russia prepared something far more effective: paperwork. A lawsuit. Filed not in Brussels. Not in The Hague. But in a Moscow arbitration court. The claim was enormous, not symbolic, not rhetorical. Trillions in rubles. The logic was brutally simple. You are holding our money. You refuse to return it. Therefore you are in default. And defaults have consequences. No one in Brussels believed the Russian court itself mattered. On paper it didn't. But courts don't operate in a vacuum, enforcement does. Because if that ruling stood, Russia wouldn't need Belgium's permission to act. It could seize Western assets on its own territory. Assets held by banks. By funds. By institutions connected, directly or indirectly, to Euroclear. This wasn't retaliation for political effect. It was symmetrical retaliation. Asset for asset, balance sheet for balance sheet. And suddenly the risk wasn't abstract. If Russia moved first, Euroclear could be declared insolvent overnight. Not because it had done something illegal in Europe, but because it would be unable to absorb losses imposed elsewhere. And if Euroclear failed, it wouldn't fail quietly. Settlements would freeze. Markets would seize. Trust would evaporate. The heart of Europe's financial system would skip a beat. And that's when one country realized it was standing directly under the blade. Belgium. Because if things went wrong, it wouldn't be Europe that got sued. It would be Belgium. Its courts. Its guarantees. Its balance sheet. The political credit would be shared. The financial risk would not. In the next part, we'll look at the moment when Belgium finally said no, and why a warning from the central bank turned hesitation into outright retreat. This is where fear became policy. Politicians can debate for days. Central banks don't. They intervene only when something fundamental is at risk, and when they do, everyone listens. As the December summit approached, while leaders were still arguing over indemnities and legal language, a quiet message began circulating among negotiating teams. It didn't come from a ministry. It didn't come from a prime minister. It came from the European Central Bank. The tone was clinical. The implications were not. The ECB made one thing clear: it would not act as a backstop for the plan. No emergency liquidity. No silent guarantees. No rescue if Euroclear collapsed under retaliation. That single refusal changed everything. Because without a central bank standing behind the system, financial risk stops being theoretical. It becomes existential. The ECB's concern went far beyond Euroclear itself. This was about the euro, not as a currency people use but as a currency the world trusts. The euro is the second most important reserve currency on Earth. Countries hold it not because they agree with Europe's politics, but because they believe in Europe's rules. Property rights. Legal predictability. The idea that money held in Europe is safe, regardless of who you are. Confiscating sovereign assets, even indirectly, would shatter that belief. The signal to the world would be unmistakable. Your reserves are safe, until they aren't. Until politics change. Until alliances shift. Until you fall out of favor. And once that signal is sent, it can't be taken back. Central banks don't debate morality. They watch flows. And the ECB warned that if this precedent were set, capital would start moving out of euros into gold, into other currencies, into anything that looked safer. Borrowing costs for European governments would rise. Debt would become more expensive. Inflation would return through the back door. The ECB's message was blunt. Funding Ukraine is a political objective. Preserving the euro is a survival objective. And survival always wins. With that, the safety net disappeared. Belgium now faced unlimited downside risk with no monetary protection. Germany and France hesitated to share liability. The legal structure was cracking. And then another fault line opened, this time in southern Europe. In the next part, we'll see how national interests broke the illusion of European unity, and how geopolitics, banking exposure, and Washington politics finished the job. This is where the consensus finally collapsed. From the outside, the European Union speaks in one voice. Inside the room, it rarely does. As the risks became concrete, lawsuits, seizures, retaliation, the language shifted. Grand statements about unity gave way to quieter questions. Who pays? Who guarantees? Who absorbs the loss if this goes wrong? And that's when national interest reasserted itself. Italy was the first to break the spell. On paper, Rome supported Ukraine. Politically, it still did. But finance has a way of cutting through symbolism. Italian banks had real exposure inside Russia. Not hypothetical, not future, but existing, stranded capital. Billions of euros. If Russia moved against Euroclear, it wouldn't stop there. It would seize whatever assets it could reach. Bank by bank. Country by country. Judgments would need to be satisfied, and Italian institutions sat close to the front of the line. This wasn't about solidarity anymore. It was about shareholders. About balance sheets. About domestic fallout. Supporting the plan now meant accepting that Italian banks, and by extension Italian savers, would help pay for it. That calculation didn't survive scrutiny. Belgium, already under direct threat, found an ally. And with that alliance came a simple but devastating argument. Moral clarity does not cover financial liability. Without airtight legal protection, proceeding wasn't brave, it was reckless. At the same time, another shadow loomed over the summit. Washington. By late 2025, it was clear that a new administration was coming. And unlike the previous one, it viewed frozen Russian assets not as a cash register, but as leverage. A bargaining chip. From that perspective, spending the assets made no sense. Once gone, they were gone. No incentive left. No pressure point to bring Russia to the table in a future negotiation. Seizing the money would feel satisfying, but it would also burn the bridge. European leaders understood the implication immediately. Acting now risked putting Europe out of step with the next US president, the same president who would define NATO's future. That was not a risk anyone wanted to take. So one by one, the pillars of the plan collapsed. Legal certainty vanished. Financial guarantees evaporated. Political unity fractured. By the early hours of the morning, the truth was unavoidable. There would be no confiscation. In the final part, we'll see how Europe tried to save face, what decision replaced the plan, who ultimately pays the price, and what this episode reveals about power in the modern financial world. And that lesson goes far beyond this war. By 4 o'clock in the morning, the decision was no longer debated. It was accepted. The risks had stacked too high. Legal exposure. Financial contagion. Monetary instability. Geopolitical misalignment. One by one, every pillar supporting the confiscation plan had collapsed under its own weight. So Europe pivoted. Quietly, decisively, without ceremony. Instead of taking Russia's money, the European Union chose to take on its own debt. A massive joint borrowing program. Tens of billions raised on the markets, backed by the EU budget. Safe. Predictable. Expensive. The interest would be paid by European taxpayers. The risk would sit on European balance sheets. No moral victory. No dramatic headlines. Just stability. To soften the optics, leaders added a compromise. The Russian assets would remain frozen indefinitely. No more 6-month renewals. No countdown clocks. The money would stay locked away until reparations were paid. A hostage but not a casualty. When morning came, the headlines spoke of unity and resolve. But behind closed doors, there was something closer to relief. Europe had stepped back from the edge. Russia's threat of symmetrical retaliation had worked. Not through force but through integration. The global financial system was simply too interconnected to cut one piece out without bleeding everywhere else. Euroclear survived. The euro remained stable. The system protected itself. But someone still had to pay. The bill didn't disappear, it just changed names. It arrived quietly, addressed not to Moscow, but to millions of European citizens who would never be mentioned in the press releases. And that is the real lesson of December 2025. We like to believe that politics commands finance, that leaders can decree justice and the balance sheets will obey. But this crisis revealed the opposite. Finance sets the boundaries. Law enforces them. Politics operates inside them. When moral ambition collided with legal reality and systemic risk, Europe chose preservation over punishment. Not because it lacked conviction, but because the cost of breaking the rules of global finance was higher than the cost of keeping them. The assets remain frozen. The war continues. And the ledgers stay balanced. Because in the end, revolutions are rarely financed by confiscation. They are financed the same way they always have been, with debt. If you want to understand how power really works in the modern world, not how it's described but how it's constrained, this is exactly what we explore here. Welcome to Finance Archives. Subscribe and we'll keep digging into the stories buried beneath the numbers, the ones that quietly shape history while everyone else is watching the headlines.